The climate on Earth that we enjoy, which we should enjoy for its wonders, results from a complex array of forces that we can neither actually see nor alter. However, we can touch the unseen with the mind and understand its processes by their effects that are in many cases physically measurable. By looking at the measurable evidence that we find in our world, it becomes possible to reconstruct our climate history. On this path, science takes us back in time more than 500 million years. This remarkable achievement was made possible by measuring the ratio of heavy oxygen in historic samples that were laid up in deep-sea sediments in the form of seashells and also fossils. Since the ratio of the heavy oxygen, termed oxygen 18 for its atomic weight, varies with the changes in ocean surface temperature, the measurements of the variance enables us to reconstruct a fairly accurate historic climate record. The result is amazing. The climate on Earth has been on a roller coaster ride between extremely hot and cold climates for all of the 500 million years that we have measurements for. This knowledge is fairly new, but less understood is the fact that the roller coaster ride is itself the end product of the operation of electromagnetic principles that shape the entire range of the cosmic phenomena, from the gigantic galactic scene to the smaller solar scene, and all the way down to the planetary scene in which we live. The principle is that when electric currents flow in two parallel wires in the same direction, the wires are pulled towards each other by the magnetic fields created by the electric currents, termed the Lorentz force. When the current is free-flowing in space in the form of moving electrically charged particles called plasma, the entire flow is pinched together. The pinching effect makes the electric flow denser, which in turn increases the pinching effect. When the pinch effect becomes extreme, the magnetic fields turn inward and force the plasma to flow backwards, whereby they concentrate under a magnetic confinement dome. The backwards focused magnetic fields also open a hole through which the concentrated plasma can escape and flow onto a sun or a galaxy. After some of the plasma is consumed by a sun or galaxy, the now weakened plasma stream flows on and expands again. We can see the node points principle often reflected in string-like formations of both stars and galaxies. Since the string-like formations are electric in nature, the individual plasma streams have a specific resonance. In the case of our galaxy, the resonance effects are effectively combined. The thereby ever-changing plasma density in the galaxy necessarily also affects the stars in the galaxies and the climate they create on whatever planets they hold. The basic principle that powers a galaxy and affects the intensity of its operation is the same basic principle that powers the stars within a galaxy and affects the intensity of their operation. Both reflect the same principle. In the case of the galaxy, the effect is extremely large, and the plasma resonance times are extremely long. In the case of stars within the galaxy, the basic principle and its effects are expressed on a much smaller scale. And of course, what affects the stars is reflected through onto the planets. In the case of humanity living on Earth, its living is affected by the conditions that are forced onto the Earth by the combined effects of all these dynamics. That's what we see reflected in the roller coaster type climate fluctuations in the Earth's history that we have a record of. We see two extremely long intergalactic resonance cycles reflected, which are overlaid onto each other. We see a very long 150 million years resonance cycle reflected, and we also see overlaid onto it a lesser 31 million years resonance cycle. The resonance times reflect the lengths of the resonating plasma streams. The 31 million years resonance cycle may reflect the length of the plasma stream between our galaxy and the Andromeda galaxy that is 2.5 million light-years distant. And the longer 150 million years resonance cycle may reflect the 12.5 million light-years distance to the neighboring galaxy M83. That our galaxy is located at a node point between two intergalactic plasma streams has recently been photographed by NASA, observed in X-ray and gamma-ray light. NASA has photographed two gigantic confinement domes extended from both sides of the galactic disk. The shape of these structures is typical for primal field structures, as they have been discovered in laboratory experiments. For example, the observed shape and position of the galactic plasma confinement domes is identical in principle with the geometry obtained in high-energy plasma flow experiments conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The resulting combination of the resonance effects of the connected intergalactic plasma streams naturally affects the galaxy as a whole and our solar system with it, which of course also affects the climate on Earth in a big way, since it is the sun, after all, that creates our climate in the first place. Thus we see both of the long resonance cycles laid onto each other, which in the current time frame just happened to be at their combined low point. The combined low creates the conditions for ice ages to be possible. This coincidence of these minimal conditions is extremely rare. The last occurrence was 450 million years ago, and the modern occurrence that still continues began roughly 2 million years ago. This means that what we see reflected on Earth in terms of cosmic forced climate changes is very real and is becoming increasingly very dangerous for us because of its major consequences for our living. The bottom line is that the climate on Earth is presently at the end stage of 100 million years long deep-cutting climate slump with effects that are hard to imagine for the lack of a historic precedent. For example, halfway through the 100 million years climate slump, Antarctica froze up. This happened around 35 million years ago. Then, afterwards, it thawed out again and froze up once more around 12 million years ago and remained frozen while the Earth continued to get colder. Now that we are much farther down the line, the general climate on Earth has become the coldest it has been for the last 440 million years. The dawn of humanity began about 2 to 3 million years ago, almost at the end of the deep cold slump that is still continuing. If we expand the last few million years of the slump into the cold climates a bit more, some amazing details come to light. You may note that the climate is now way below the level where Antarctica froze up. Our age is located near the bottom of this long downtrend. Near the end of it, around 2 million years ago, the ice ages began. When we expand the low end again, we find that the ice ages were of shorter duration at first, occurring in cycles of 41,000 years. But as the Earth became still colder, the glaciation cycles became longer in duration, to roughly 100,000 years in length. The deep climate slump that we see here, with fine details at its lowest point, is the result of the plasma density in the galaxy becoming weaker. It would be surprising if the interstellar plasma streams that power our Sun would not be affected by the weakening plasma environment in the galaxy. Thereby, we can recognize the climate on Earth as a proxy that reflects the galactic climate. When the interstellar environment throughout the galaxy weakens, and the plasma streams that power our Sun diminish below the minimal threshold level that is required for our Sun to operate in its high-powered mode, a dramatic phase shift happens in the solar system that changes the way the system operates. The transformation takes place when the lack of sufficient plasma flow volume causes one of the sets of primal fields to collapse, which are presently a major contributor to the process that powers the solar system. After the collapse of this set of primal fields, the solar system becomes less intensely powered, and a deep ice age begins. Evidence suggests that our Sun is located at the center of a system of multiple nested primal fields, each with its own resonance characteristics. The innermost set of primal fields creates the 11 years solar cycles. It is also the innermost system that creates the high-density plasma that is focused on our Sun and energizes the planetary ecliptic. When this innermost system collapses, a much wider and less dense stream of plasma then encompasses our Sun. At this point, the Sun reverts to a less powered mode and operates with a lower surface temperature, possibly in the range of 4,000 degrees instead of the current 5,800 degrees Kelvin. That's when a full ice age begins. We are not there yet, but we will be there in the 2050s. The evidence that such an intricately powered system exists has been measured by the Ulysses spacecraft that flew 3 orbits over the poles of the Sun. In each of the orbits, the spacecraft encountered a gap in the solar wind over the poles, precisely where one would expect the plasma connection of the Sun with the primal fields to be located. Now let's keep this in mind when we expand the time frame of the last few of the deep cold ice age cycles. We note that these ice age cycles are made up of 2 distinct periods. A deep glaciation period lasting for roughly 90,000 years, with the Sun operating at its low-powered mode, and a short interglacial warm period that's lasting roughly 13,000 years, with the Sun operating at its high-powered mode. The transition between the two, the low-powered mode and the high-powered mode, is determined by the resonance time of the interstellar plasma streams and the length of the period of their peak intensity. Now if we expand the last glacial period still further, some rather interesting details come into view. We see numerous extremely large climate oscillations occurring. These oscillations take us from deep glaciation conditions extremely fast to near interglacial conditions, which then diminish again, though somewhat more slowly, back to the deep glacial level that they started with. When the oscillations were first discovered, they were thought to be a local anomaly. After a second ice core was drilled out several hundred miles further north on the Greenland ice sheet, the same oscillations were encountered again, with identical timing, which proved them to be global phenomena. When the researchers Dansgaard and Oeschger took a closer look, they discovered that the oscillations occurred with clockwork precision at periodic intervals of 1470 years. The precise timing of these Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations becomes significant to us in modern times. It may have been the continuance of the oscillations in the background all the way through the interglacial period that provided the tremendous boost to our Sun in the early 1700s that broke the Earth out of the Little Ice Age in the 1700s by ramping up the Sun at this time. When one counts backwards from the start of the last Dansgaard-Oeschger pulse at roughly 15,000 years ago, based on the 1470 years intervals. A pulse should have occurred 300 years before the year 2000, in the early 1700s. That's what we see evident in the upramping of the Sun at this time, by which the Little Ice Age ended. When one looks at the ice core data for the current interglacial period, many random fluctuations come to light. They all appear unrelated to the periodic intervals of the Dansko-Oeschger oscillations. This seems to suggest that the Dansko-Oeschger events only come into play when the Sun is extremely weak, for which the Little Ice Age period would qualify. The interglacial ice core data reveals that around 3,500 years ago, a gradual underlying weakening of the solar system began that reflected itself forward all the way through the Little Ice Age. This weakening baseline is also evident when we expand the last 1,000 years with measurements for the finer details. Here we see the underlying weakening continuing in the small. This time we are not looking at the standard ice core data, where changing oxygen-18 ratios reflect temperature changes. Instead, we are looking at measurements that, in proxy, reflect historic solar activity. Yes, we can actually measure the intensity of the activity of the Sun going back 1,000 years into the past. This is possible by measuring carbon-14 ratios. Carbon-14 is a rare isotope that is generated when cosmic rays, which primarily originate at the Sun, collide with the Earth's atmosphere. Cosmic rays are not rays in the standard sense, but are single events of fast-moving plasma particles, primarily protons. Their interaction with the atmosphere causes a chain of effects in which neutrons are ejected by some atoms. The neutrons are in turn captured by nitrogen atoms, where they replace a proton. The end result is that the nitrogen atom becomes a carbon-14 atom. That's the only natural process by which carbon-14 is created in the air, until the age of the nuclear bombs and bomb testing. Up to this time, roughly the 1950s, changing carbon-14 ratios in historic samples gave us a measurement of the intensity of solar activity for the time of the sample. The measurements of carbon-14 as a proxy for solar activity became possible by the simple fact that whenever solar activity is intense, the cosmic ray flux from the Sun is low in volume. This is so because for the Sun to be intensely active, being intensely powered, it needs to be surrounded by a densely concentrated shell of plasma. However, the dense plasma shell around the Sun, which makes it stronger, traps most of the cosmic ray flux coming from the surface of the Sun. Inversely, when the plasma shell around the Sun is weak, or less dense, the solar activity is weaker. Of course, when a weaker shell surrounds the Sun, greater volumes of cosmic ray flux are able to escape from the Sun. By this inverse relationship, higher volumes of cosmic ray flux are the resulting effect of a weaker Sun. The amount of minimum in solar activity, which corresponds with the Little Ice Age, is therefore the consequence of large volumes of cosmic ray flux coming from the Sun. The resulting cosmic ray increase has a strong cooling effect on the atmosphere. When I speak of a weaker sun, I do not mean a colder sun. The sun's surface temperature does not change significantly when the sun gets weaker, nor does the sun's radiated energy change significantly over the course of its 11-year solar cycles, while the sunspot numbers vary in large amounts. The solar system is so extremely well regulated that its radiated energy fluctuates only 0.1% over the course of these cycles. Only the solar cosmic ray volume varies largely when that solar activity varies. That the solar cosmic ray volume varies largely over the course of the solar cycles is also measurable in the ratio of beryllium-10 in historic samples. Beryllium-10 is another atomic isotope that is exclusively produced by cosmic ray interaction with the atmosphere. Here too, as the sun gets weaker over time, the beryllium-10 measurements, which reflect cosmic ray volumes, are growing larger, with the largest amounts measured during the Maunder minimum of solar activity, which was the coldest period of the Little Ice Age. Cosmic ray interaction with the atmosphere has an enormously large effect on our climate, which the changing ratio of carbon-14 and beryllium-10 are fringe effects indicators of. Since cosmic rays are events of fast-moving electrically charged particles flowing through the atmosphere, they ionize atomic elements in their path by electromagnetic induction. The ionized elements that now radiate an electric potential are 100 times more attractive to water vapor molecules than non-ionized atoms are. Since water molecules have a natural electric dipole characteristic, the water vapor molecules latch onto the ionized materials and start a chain reaction of cloud nucleation. Once the process is started, it expands by the normal dynamics of the cloud-forming process. When the normal conditions for cloud nucleation exist, the induction of cosmic ray ionization can increase the normal cloud and rain forming 100-fold. That's how changing cosmic ray volumes can dramatically alter the climate on Earth, because the extent of cloudiness has an enormous effect on the climate on Earth. The white tops of clouds form a reflective surface that reflects a significant amount of the incoming solar energy back into space, which is thereby lost to the heat budget of the Earth, so that the Earth gets colder. In this way, the effects of the sun can alter the climate on Earth tremendously, while the sun's radiated energy remains relatively constant. The dramatic effect that the changing solar activity has on the climate, which happens in the background, where it affects the volume of cosmic rays emitted from the sun, has been experimentally verified with the cloud experiment that was conducted some years ago at the CERN laboratory in Europe. During the experiment, a large chamber was filled with water vapor that had artificial cosmic rays injected from one of the lab's particle accelerators. The results were measured. At first, the result of the natural cloud nucleation was measured, which was very low. Then the normal enhancing factors were added, which are common in the atmosphere, such as electric potentials that pervade the atmosphere, especially within large cloud structures. The resulting increase was measured too. A significant increase was noted. After that, the artificial cosmic rays were added. The measured increase was phenomenal. The plotted values went straight up and off the chart. With its experiment, the CERN lab proved in principle that cosmic rays have such an enormous impact on the cloudiness on Earth and with it on our climate, so that all the great climate variations are the direct result of this process and continue to be that. These facts illustrate the deep-reaching effect that solar cosmic ray flux has on the Earth's climate, while the Sun's energy radiation remains at a near constant level. Thus, we see large climate changes happening while the Sun's surface temperature remains essentially constant. This paradoxical seeming relationship of cosmic ray flux forcing the climate on Earth while the Sun remains constant is important to keep in mind because it renders the general perception of the solar process to be incorrect. It takes the wind out of the sails of the political forces that insist that climate change is a man-made phenomenon. That human activity has no effect on the Earth's climate, as the great leaders in the world insist it has, is evident by the obvious fact that the climate on Earth does not follow the doctrines of political assumptions, no matter how strongly humanity believes and promotes the false assumptions. Once this is recognized, the assumptions can be brought in line with the scientific reality. A worldwide university-type focus can accomplish that, especially since the most obvious facts are already acknowledged. The political leaders on the climate front are correct if they are recognizing the global climate is changing enormously and that the changes are deeply affecting humanity, so that corresponding responses by humanity are required for humanity to have a future. All this is true. The climate is changing, and the change is measurable. Hard evidence exists in scientific physical measurements that prove clearly and monumentally that the historic climate changes of the Earth have followed directly the course of the variations in solar activity that has been observed and measured by the resulting variations in solar cosmic ray flux that is measured in carbon-14 ratios. Thus, the climate on Earth is demonstrably varying with the activity of the Sun. The bottom line is that all climate changes on Earth are cosmic in origin and are thereby exclusively cosmic climate changes. It is self-evident, of course, that human activity does not affect the Sun in any way whatsoever. It would be wonderful if we had the power to affect the Sun. This would enable us to solve a lot of critical problems. Unfortunately, we don't have this capability and likely never will have it. However, we do have the power to uplift our perception of the dynamics of the sun and to adjust our responses to its effects. So what do we see happening? The solar dynamics are very real, and they are affecting our living on this planet extremely deeply, with much more to come in the decades ahead as we are moving towards the big ice age phase shift in the 2050s. Until we get to this stage, many deep-cutting fringe effects will affect us that will force us to change our world long before the actual ice age phase shift happens. We are moving towards enormous climate changes, while the sun gets progressively weaker, though its surface temperature remains largely unaltered, almost to the point of the ice age phase shift itself. Sure, it is hard for one who has been schooled in false doctrines to get used to the fact that the sun alone is capable of forcing the dramatic changes in the climate of the Earth that we experience, and that it does it tremendously, while its surface temperature doesn't vary. This is a key element in the climate dynamics that we need to keep in mind when the sun's surface temperature does not change while the climate is changing, so that it is tempting to blame humanity as the cause for the change and its industrial revolution that happened in the background at the time when the Earth was getting warmer. That the resulting pledge by humanity to save the Earth is falsely focused becomes apparent when the solar dynamics behind the changing climate and its governing principles become understood. It is hard for one to acknowledge that all the climate changes that have been experienced in the past few thousand years were forced exclusively by the ever-changing solar cosmic ray flux, rather than by direct changes, such as by the changing density of CO2 in the air that is affected somewhat by human activity. However, when one sees measurable evidence that links the changing solar activity with the changing climate, the false assumptions fall away in an honest scientific environment. The 800 years of general solar downramping that has been measured that resulted in the Little Ice Age period, which was followed by 300 years of solar upramping that gave us 300 years of solar global warming, have both resulted while the sun's radiated energy had remained nearly constant throughout this time. The ups and downs on the carbon-14 chart does not represent values of solar surface temperature, which had remained constant throughout, but reflects instead the measured values of the changing solar cosmic ray flux that is a fringe effect of deep changes happening on the sun in the background to what is visible. These deep changes are evidently not caused by the sun itself, but by external factors that affect the sun. A very big external event happened in the 1700s. The external event was so big that it prevented the startup of the big ice age that the diminishing solar system was heading towards. Something had suddenly reversed the long downramping of the sun and caused a major recovery of it, and the subsequently climate variations that started the 300 years of global warming. As I had previously indicated, the dramatic solar reversal may have been caused by a Dansker-Oeschger event. The periodicity of the Dansker-Oeschger events at 1470 years intervals could have caused the solar uplift to occur in the early 1700s that we see reflected in the carbon-14 measurements and in the historic climate reversal. A Dansker-Oeschger event has a similar characteristic as a dump bucket in water parks. The bucket takes a specific time to fill and then dumps its load in a big splash of short duration, after which it fills up again. That's how a Dansker-Oeschger event may have strengthened the Sun in the 1700s. It thereby reduced the Sun's cosmic ray flux that gave us, as a consequence, 300 years of solar-forced global warming. The big splash ended around the year 2000. With it, the global warming ended. If the Dansker-Oeschger poles had not intervened in the 1700s, the previously established 200 years cycle might have continued, which gave us 100 years uptrend in solar activity, followed by 100 years downtrend. These up and down waves appear comparable to waves on water, which are totally different in character to the dump bucket dynamics. Without the dump bucket event intervening, it is highly likely that the full Ice Age startup may have resulted from the Sun's continuing weakening had the Little Ice Age continued. If this had happened, we wouldn't exist today. When the full Ice Age starts, which starts at a minimal threshold in solar activity, an entirely different world comes into being. At this point, the Sun's surface temperature drops to a lower level, to about 4,000 degrees Kelvin, by which about 70% less energy is being radiated. At this point, all regions outside the tropics become rapidly uninhabitable. Agriculture becomes disabled in these regions, and possibly everywhere else too. No one was prepared for such a change in the 1700s. No one can live without food. Neither are we prepared for such a change today. But we have the capacity today to make the necessary preparations for the next time when the Sun weakens to the point when the phase shift to the next Ice Age occurs, which may happen in the 2050s. Fortunately, a Dansker-Oeschger pulse had intervened and had boosted the Sun back up. We also see the 200 years cycle continuing, being modulated onto the up-ramping of the Sun. This means that the first part of the second 200 years cycle was the up-ramping of the wave from 1900 to 2000, so that the portion after 2000 would be the down-ramping 100 years part of the wave. That's the wave that affected the Sun from the year 2000 to the present and is continuing. With the dump bucket having spent its load, the down wave is now in a free-fall collapse towards its only remaining possible support by the still declining background level. We see the fast collapsing down wave reflected in the fast collapsing solar wind pressure that the Ulysses satellite has reported in the form of a 30% diminishment over the space of 10 years, both in the solar wind pressure and in the solar magnetic field. The fast rate of collapse that we now see is what one would expect to see, with the denser pulse having run its course, and the down-ramping part of the 200 years wave finding no inhibiting underlying support. This means that we are now in such a fast rate of collapse that the phase shift threshold to the next ice age will likely be crossed long before the 100 years down-ramping comes to an end. The phase shift will likely happen in the 2050s. However, before we get to the phase shift, a lot of ever bigger fringe effects will hit us, and some of them badly. In less than 10 years from the present, the sun will be as weak again as it had been 300 years ago during the Maunder minimum, with no sunspots visible. The solar cycle 25 will be spotless. 10 years after that, the solar wind will have diminished to zero. The solar cosmic ray flux will have increased enormously throughout this period, with ever larger droughts, floods, and frost events happening. On this path of the fast diminishing sun, we will likely see mega floods happening that rival the epic flood story in the Bible. All this will happen on the steep slope leading up to the Ice Age phase shift in the 2050s. We are in a cosmic climate change collapse phase. The first faint measurements of the collapse phase were made by the Solar Terrestrial Institute in Irkutsk. The measurements were made on the ground. The message was clear. The 300 years period of solar global warming is over. The support for the sun is collapsing. A new age for humanity has begun. The new age was ushered in with a bang. The age of the small had ended. In May 1999, a series of big disasters suddenly happened. The age of the big has begun. We saw more than 60 tornado outbreaks occurring in the USA in a 7-day period in early May 1999. We saw storms in the maximum category, the F5 category, with winds up to 300 miles per hour or 484 kilometers an hour. The storm generated hail balls up to 4.5 inches in diameter, or 11 centimeters. This single storm caused 50 fatalities, 895 injuries, and 1.5 billion in damages. The same sort of thing happened in the arena of the big floods. As if a page was turned, from May 1999 onward, big flooding disasters were happening in various parts of the world, in Bavaria, Switzerland, Mexico, Vietnam, France, and Venezuela. More details are in the transcripts. In May, Bavaria and Germany suffered major floods. In July, in Switzerland, a large sudden flash flood turned a river rafting adventure into a catastrophe. In October, Mexico suffered floods, followed by a large Vietnamese flood, in which 793 people died, 55,000 became homeless, and 290 million in damages was caused, with 1.7 million people being affected thereby. Then, in December of that year, in France, the Belair's nuclear power plant was flooded, which nearly became a crisis. And likewise in mid-December, the state of Vargas in Venezuela suffered an enormous mudslide tragedy after 3 days of enormous rainfall. The town of Los Carles was buried under 3 meters of mud. That's 9.8 feet of it. A high percentage of the homes in that area were simply swept into the ocean. Entire towns like Cerro Grande and Carmen de Uria completely disappeared. As much as 10% of the entire population of the state of Vargas perished in this flood, with the death toll in the range of 10,000 to 30,000. All this happened at the same time that we saw the big upturn happening of the measured average ground temperature in Irkutsk. It appears, in retrospect, that the cause for all this may have begun much earlier. The peak of the solar-forced global warming appears to have occurred in the 1960s, when the highest sunspot ratios were recorded. The carbon-14 chart stops just short of this time, because with the start of the nuclear bomb tests and the bombing itself, a new source for carbon-14 was added so that the historic measurements no longer exclusively reflected changing solar activity and thereby became useless. According to the sunspot counts, the sun began to weaken after the 1960s. It weakened dramatically, which gave us Hurricane Betsy in 1965 with 155-mile-an-hour wind, and Hurricane Carmel in 1969 with 175 miles per hour winds. Each was the most expensive storm for its time in terms of the damages it caused. In the 1980s, going into the 1990s, the sun recovered somewhat. However, the underlying weakening continued and began to take its toll. Several years before the resulting global cooling was measured on the ground in Irkutsk in 1998, the effects of the weaker sun became evident in the form of major climate events, starting with a big flooding event in 1995. In 1995, heavy rainfall extended for 3 days in May in the lower Mississippi Basin in the range of 10 to 30 inches. The event caused the big 1995 Louisiana flooding that left behind more damage than the 2 previous hurricanes combined, though far fewer people died in the 1995 rainfall disaster. It became apparent by these occurrences that the weaker the sun becomes, the worse the fringe effects of it become. As one might expect, the next year, 1996, was worse in terms of flooding. In January, the state of Oregon in the USA experienced its largest flood of the decade. It extended from the Oregon coast east to the Cascade Mountains. Then later in May, a large cyclone caused historic scale flooding in the southern Arabian Peninsula, with the heaviest rainfall in 70 years. It damaged 1,000 kilometers of roads, 21 bridges, killed 341 people, destroyed 100,000 acres of crops, and caused $1.2 billion in damage. And after that, on July 19th and 20th in Canada, a series of flash floods hit the region in Quebec. The flood was said to have been the biggest overland flood in the 20th century of Canadian history. In these 2 days, as much rain fell in the region than flows over Niagara Falls in 4 weeks. Altogether, 488 homes were destroyed, 1,230 were damaged, and 16,000 people were evacuated from the area. 7 people were killed, and 10 more died in the mudslides produced by the rain that caused $1.5 billion in damages. Later, in the same year, in October, a large cyclone swept across southern India. The rainfall breached 112 dams and reservoirs. The flooding destroyed 4 million acres of crops, damaged 53,000 houses, and killed 388 people. And all of this happened in that single 1 year of the ongoing weakening of the sun that emits increasing larger cosmic ray showers. In the year thereafter, in April 1997, the Red River flood in the United States occurred. While it caused no deaths, its damages amount to a whopping $3.5 billion. Later, in July 1997, the Central European Great Flood occurred. In 2 consecutive floods in July, with the heaviest rainfalls in recorded history, extending across the Czech Republic, Poland, and Germany, the floodwaters rose 2 to 3 meters above the previously recorded averages. It caused over 100 deaths and damages in the range of $4.5 billion. And it still got worse after that in the summer of 1998. That's when China experienced widespread flooding on the Yangtze River and also the Nan River and the Shanghua River in the north that are both tributary to the Amur, and in the south of the Pearl River system. The China flooding disaster happened after massive torrential rains had hit the area. The statistics are staggering. The flooding left 3,704 dead, 15 million homeless, 13.3 million houses damaged or destroyed. 180 million people were affected by this single flood, and 25 million acres of farmland were devastated. These horrific, catastrophic events all preceded the big events from the 1990s on the continuing slope of the weakening sun. On this downslope, also a rapid increase in earthquakes is encountered, caused by the increasing solar cosmic ray volume. As cosmic rays, which are events of high-energy electrically charged particles, shower the Earth with particles 100,000 times smaller than the smallest atom, their electric charge builds up an electric potential within the Earth in metals and rocks. The associated electric and magnetic forces apparently have a significant impact on the geological dynamics. This appears to explain why earthquake events have become more frequent since the solar weakening has begun, with its increased volumes of cosmic ray showers reaching the Earth. While the human body typically encounters an estimated 50,000 cosmic ray events per day, which by electric induction may aid the human neurological processes that operate electrically. The vastly larger electric induction into the Earth itself has evidently a significant effect. Its increase coincides with large increases in earthquake events. Prior to 1999, the biggest earthquake event in China was the Lijiang earthquake in February 1996 in Yunnan in the southwestern part of China. The shock was small. It measured 6.6 on the Richter scale. Nevertheless, 322 people died, 17,000 were injured, and 358,000 buildings were destroyed. 320,000 people became homeless, and 200 landslides were triggered in a 12,000 square kilometer area. During the reconstruction, aided by the World Bank, many high-rise buildings in that area that had remained standing were torn down subsequently and replaced with traditional-style single-family dwellings. The Lijiang earthquake, however, as hard as it was nevertheless just a small beginning on an endlessly expanding trail with many more earthquakes to come across China at an increasing rate. When one compares the historic averages of the numbers of earthquakes prior to the year 2000 with the averages from 2000 on to 2011, for which I had conducted the study, some rather astonishing rates of increase come to light. While some earthquake occurrences coincide with solar flares and solar wind events, the astonishing rate of increase suggests, however, that the increase is more likely contributable to the underlying increase in cosmic ray flux, which is the only factor that has been dramatically increasing since the weakening of the Sun began in the 1960s. For Japan, for example, we have seen 27 earthquakes recorded in the 1360 years prior to the year 2000, followed by 15 earthquakes in the next 12 years. While the historic numbers are obviously tainted by the lack of historic reporting, the increase is nevertheless rather astonishing. And even within those 12 years after 2000, for which accurate numbers are available, as an example for the USA, a larger increase is apparent for the years of the solar minimum that correspond with higher volumes of cosmic ray flux. So what does this all mean? It means, for starters, that the solar dynamics have a great deal more to do with down-to-earth human living than we care to acknowledge, which, though they are immense, are still just a part of the beginning that will continue for another 30 years, after which things get worse if humanity remains in the rut with its eyes closed as it presently does. Earthquakes, floods, and also droughts are immensely destructive, especially when they unfold into the extreme. Unfortunately, the forces that cause them are out of our control, and they are immense. Cosmic forces are immense. However, we have the power to avoid their effects. The path is simple, in principle, that avoids all three types of calamities simultaneously. Floods can be avoided by shifting our living, including our agriculture, afloat onto the equatorial seas between the hurricane bands. Floods are not possible afloat on the sea. Earthquakes have no effect there either. Nor are droughts possible for indoor agriculture afloat onto the seas, supplied by deep ocean reverse osmosis desalination. In addition, we need to be situated at the equator when the next ice age begins in the 2050s, which likewise cannot be avoided. At this time, a deep phase shift in the solar system will cause the Sun to revert back to its normal glaciation state by the loss of a set of primal fields. At this state, it will radiate 70% less energy. As a consequence, nearly all regions outside the tropics will become uninhabitable. If we are not prepared for this, civilization ends. Humanity ends. It is for this reason that we should count ourselves fortunate that the ever-increasing floods and earthquakes and droughts will at length impel us to go where we need to be, and should have started to move towards many years ago already. We have wasted 40 years already by avoiding this path that we cannot avoid without suffering the consequences. We have avoided this path while dreaming of the ghost of global warming. The longer we wait, however, the longer we avoid stepping up to the plate, the greater the tragedies will become that we thereby allow to come upon us. While the cosmic dynamics force extensive climate effects to happen that we cannot prevent, the increasing severity of the events will ultimately force us to take the logical steps to avoid the consequences. That's how cosmic dynamics will at length force humanity to change the mode of its living. And if we pay attention, we will even note that the dark clouds of cosmic climate change comes with a silver lining. The increasing cosmic ray flux that causes calamities also appears to increase plant growth for enhanced food production. How great the tragedies will ultimately become before we step up to the plate that the cosmic dynamics lay before us cannot be forecast. We may be stubborn and suffer immensely. We can also respond quickly, like the founding fathers of the USA have. While the founding fathers had noted that humanity is more inclined to suffer tragic impositions for as long as these are sufferable, before it takes the needed steps to gain its freedom from them. The founders had also learned their lesson and had acted resolutely once they had recognized the underlying trap. In the case of the USA, the line to resolute actions was crossed with the historic act when the colonies on the American continent boldly raised themselves up, standing together, and declared their independence from the chokehold of empire. They stood so tall on this platform of self-recognition that they defended their recognized inherent freedom, and for a season had inspired the whole world to do so likewise. This can happen again. Humanity has the power to raise itself up once more, and in the same manner declare itself its freedom from the now fast unfolding cosmic climate change impositions. The power of the human mind is so immensely great and expansive that almost anything is possible. For this reason, ironically, it is not possible to forecast what humanity's response to the now ongoing cosmic climate changes will be. The possibilities for our responding are endless. The potentials are great. Any attempt, therefore, to forecast the human future would imply that humanity is not human. As human beings, we have the power to reshape the world far beyond our tallest dreams, and to do it quickly and in a manner that far exceeds the limits that even our tallest dreaming imposes. Dreams are simply too small to measure up to our creative and productive capacity. We only discover what we can achieve by achieving it. Thus, I venture to suggest that we might see a vast new industrial revolution erupting on the platform of our newfound freedoms, and that we might create for one another, to start with, those 6,000 new cities for 1 million people each that the cosmic climate change inspires us to build towards the next ice age, with most of them built afloat on the equatorial seas, with indoors agriculture attached to them, all linked to a world development bridge that links up with the continents. It is highly likely that we will do something like this, and not only because the cosmic climate change forces us to build ourselves a new world. I would like to suggest that we, humanity, will force ourselves into this self-protective and self-developing mode by the nature of our humanity, and that we will create these infrastructures for one another for free, as a matter of fact, as nothing else measures up. On this path, we will be ready for the next ice age that potentially begins in the 2050s, and we will reap as yet unimaginable benefits along the way. We will realize what can be achieved in a world without empire and war, and we will realize, by moving on this platform, the wondrous power of cooperative achievements. We become united thereby worldwide as a singular sovereign people with a rich individuality, which as human beings we basically already are. On this path, None of the fringe effects of cosmic climate change will harm us. Floods, droughts, earthquakes, hurricanes, and even the ice age itself will become irrelevant. And we will live richer, happier, and more secure than ever before. That's our present potential.